Welcome to this micro presentation on equity pedagogies. So no doubt, and hopefully you'll have seen the data showing the ethnicity awarding gap in UK higher education. And hopefully you'll have had a little bit of reading around how a student deficit approach to addressing the awarding gap in the UK hasn't worked, essentially. So trying to add to or change the students in a student deficit approach hasn't worked to narrow that gap between ethnically minoritized and racially minoritized students and their white counterparts. So taking a systems deficit approach instead, i.e. what needs to change about the institution, the department, the curriculum, academics and their approach to learning, teaching, assessment and feedback. What could we change within the system that would help us reduce and eradicate that awarding gap? And I think what we need to do is have a little look at what we mean by inclusive pedagogy or inclusive teaching and learning. So what you can see there on the left-hand side, you've got these kind of basic fundamentals of, let's say, culturally sustaining pedagogy, an inclusive approach to ensuring that students feel they belong, that they matter, and that they're able to learn on an equitable footing in a system that is essentially set up to reinforce and maintain that awarding gap, that ethnic awarding gap. So as you can see, creating a welcoming, safe learning space that encourages students to be unique, to make mistakes, and to connect with staff and peers. It's looking at curriculum design and strategies of teaching that enable and expect and normalise students to bring their own experiences and prior learning to contribute, to make a difference, and to connect to the subject matter at hand. So does what we teach, is it built and co-created with our students? Is it relevant and connected to their interests, their heritage, their understanding of the world? And then lastly, humanising what we do. So perhaps using humour, again, ensuring that it's relevant to the subject, sensitive to the social and cultural diversity of the group, an element of humanity and enjoyment to the learning experience. And as you can see on the right-hand side, methods of doing that. So yes, ensuring that there is representation of all types of characteristics and backgrounds in our curricular content. It's making sure that we manifest systems deficit as an approach. That means what can we do as academics, for example, is to be in a constant state of reflecting in and on our actions, our behaviours, our assumptions, and how we come across to our students, rather than thinking about students as deficient in some way that they need to be added to in order to be successful. We've got student-centred policies and practice, of course, measurable outcomes that look at equity. So, the big example there we gave at the start was the ethnicity awarding gap, but they're making sure we can disaggregate that data and look at particular intersecting aspects of identity and how groups are disproportionately disadvantaged, and how do we measure improvements in that. And actually, rather than making sort of this often benign concept of inclusivity our goal with our policies, we make social justice an explicit outcome. So rather than equality and inclusion, it's equity and eradicating these gaps. But this only goes so far. What the evidence, what the narrative, what the hypotheses are now suggesting is that we need to go a step further and look at what it means to try and decolonize the curriculum. And there are competing and differing understandings, and there's no real consensus about what this means in education, but it has been very much diluted amongst EDI, strategy, policy, etc. What you can see here is Subratanam's list of 10 kind of principles of what decolonising education should look like. And you'll see number one there is addressing shared assumptions about how the world is, and how things operate in terms of power and oppression across things like race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and so forth. So openly addressing our shared assumptions, viewpoints, lenses, and perhaps biases with these things as well. Number two is re-narrating our histories. So particularly for something like medicine and healthcare, interrogating the origins of this that are largely generated and influenced by colonialism, and making sure that that's made explicit and helping us understand how the social hierarchies, the norms, the stereotypes, and the systems that were shaped by Euro imperial expansion in the 15th, 16th centuries and onwards, how that continues to shape how minoritized groups are treated. That leads to us embracing counter narratives. So whose voices are we listening to? Whose voices do we frame as being more believable, more scientific, more trustworthy, and so on and so forth? Because what we find is that there's this system and outlook and lens where, particularly for Indigenous and Global South voices, they are less heard, they are less platformed, they are stereotyped. So embracing those and actually centering those rather than standard voices is super important. This leads us to rethinking the curriculum as well, because the very questions we ask, the very research that we think about, frames and strengthens existing powers. We can then become make sure we have our personal reflections around this. So number 5 there, identifying ways in which we might be biased and complicit in reproducing things like institutional racism. How often do we think about how we generate relationships, not just with students, but amongst colleagues and communities that we are operating within? How often, number 6 there, do we create spaces for dialogue and for being an ally if we don't occupy some of the characteristics of the marginalised groups that we're supporting to take the lead? Number 7, it's a kind of a sense of community, that we've all got some responsibility and accountability in making these changes and supporting each other to reduce these disproportionate outcomes and experiences. Again, number 8 there, just reminding us about the ideology of student deficit and where that's rooted and how we can think about ourselves and the system to challenge whose knowledge is valued and from where. Number 9 there is thinking about the university as a community and a culture that runs through all different levels and types of staffing, whether it's services staff, security staff, and so on and so forth. They're all part of this community of trying to make things better. And then doing so, with respect, security, equity, and dignity. It's not devaluing people. It's not calling people out. It's calling them in. It's offering support, and it's recognizing that particularly this work requires a huge amount of spiritual, emotional, and cognitive labor, and that for some, particularly those in marginalized groups, it's far more. There's far more risk involved, there's far more danger involved, and far more kind of risk of exhaustion and fatigue, and psychological unsafety. So this is a summary here of some of just the key points around what we should mean by inclusive, equitable teaching. So it hopefully will help us not get fixated on sort of, just diversity. So just different looking faces and then everything will be okay. It's something much deeper than that requires a very deep and ongoing personal introspection, but also ensuring that that remains connected to the wider community we work in and the structures and policies in the place that we work in.